Hey guys, this is Victor Guerrero, HBRacing team manager for the West Coast. I'm going to do a step-by-step video here, bag by bag, to show you guys how I build my D817V2 kits. That way, kind of eliminate a lot of issues. I get a lot of questions on how to build stuff. I do apologize if this isn't up to your par for video quality. This is my first video. I'm doing it just with a GoPro. So, alright, let's go and get started. First, I like to start with the shock internals. Basically what I'll do is I'll take your O-rings here and your shock internals. I'll throw a little bit of oil on the O-ring just to kind of get them lubricated prior to putting them in. Same thing with your shock guides there, or your shock shaft guides. So to throw that there, I've already installed the O-ring on the body for your lower shock retainer. I screw that on, but I don't tighten it down, and I'll show you why I do not tighten that down. So I'll do that one, I'll do the next one, throw your O-ring on there for the shock body, take your internals, throw a little oil on them, take your shock bottom, screw it on. Like I said, leave it loose. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll take shock shafts and I will chuck them up in my Dremel. If your Dremel does not have this chuck on here, I would suggest getting it A-Main Hobbies. I believe Absolute Hobbies or your local Home Depot will sell it. So basically what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to polish a shock shaft. You don't have to do this step. I think if you do it, though, you have to be consistent with doing it and doing it before every race. If you don't do it, then it'll create stiction and your car will feel different. So either don't do it or do it. If you want to do it, then I would suggest committing to it every single race to make your car consistent. So basically chuck it up in the drill about a quarter speed. Just want to get the shaft kind of hot. Lay it on here, and you'll see it melts right on there. So as it melts on there, just kind of rub it in, or polish the shaft, shock shaft that is, and that one's done. They are going to be hot, so be careful when you take them off. You will burn yourself. I've done it. Same thing. So that's shock shafts. Super easy. Doesn't take very long. That's why I choose to do it before every race. Okay, so this setup here, I'm going to start with a 5-hole 1.5. I have already pre-drilled these pistons, just for the sake of the video. What I like to do, because I have so many pistons in my box, I forget what I've drilled, what I haven't drilled, and they're kind of hard to write 1.5 on here. So what I'll do is I'll actually just put 5 dots on here. That right there will tell me at any point. I know it's a 5-hole piston because I could count how many holes there are, but it also has 5 dots, so it tells me it's a 5-hole 1.5. The dots don't rub off with the shock oil. They'll last in there for a while. So what you want to do now is take your piston. Make sure you install your washer. This is to prevent the piston from cracking, because you can crack the piston if you don't have those installed. Take your shock shaft pliers or needle nose, whatever is easier for you. I used to use needle nose for a long time. So what you want to do is tighten these down until it stops, and then I back it off just a hair. Actually, I'll go a little bit more. I want this piston to be kind of free. No deviation side to side, but a little bit free. You don't want it super bound up. I'm going to do the same thing here. There we go. So I got my shock shafts, pistons installed. Now I'm going to take my body, and I am actually going to throw a little bit of shock oil on the shaft just to prevent any stiction or tearing the O-rings. Realistically, it'll never happen, but just good practice. Install that there. You'll hear it has drag right now. That will break in and you won't have any of those issues. So same thing there. Okay, so now the next step is I like to install your shock adjuster. Same thing, you want to pre-oil every O-ring. Just it helps with the build, helps with getting it all installed correctly. I don't know why my GoPro's shutting off, but so basically pre-oil these things here, get them all ready to go. You're gonna thread them on. I like to thread them on all the way up. You could adjust this later, and you will adjust this later. Okay, so now you have both shocks pretty much built. Next step I like to do is go and fill them up with oil. So I'm going to take my 35 weight low-C weight oil, and I like to fill the body up and draw the shaft down as I'm doing it. Reason so is it'll actually pull all the air out of the shock, and you don't have to wait as long for it to disperse the air. Actually, I skipped a step. You want to tighten these down once you put your shafts in there. You tighten down the bottom collar. Reason so is you want those O-rings to be tightened around the shaft, not already tight when you push the shaft through. So once you get your shock shaft pretty much all installed, oil is now bleeding out. You let it go there. Tighten down your bottom collar. Fill the shock up. And there you go. So now the next step, we're going to take our eyelets and our shock caps, and I like to picture the shock on the car. I like to run my bleeder screws to the inside, personal preference. And you have a flat side here, and you have your beveled side here. I like to install with the flat side out. Reason so is in the event your eyelet starts to wear out, it will actually help prevent the shock from falling off while driving. Sometimes these things can be a little bit of a pain. You got to put them in at an angle. Okay, so those are installed. We're going to install your balls and your eyelets. You can use your shock shaft pliers if you like. I just grab a pair of needle nose. Easier. Those are installed. So now we're pretty much ready to bleed the shock and get it installed. So with installing the oil like I did, the shock's pretty much all out of air already. So what you're going to do is extend the shaft all the way, put your bladder on top. As you put your bladder, you want to hold your finger in there, kind of like holding the bladder in place. Push the shock shaft down just until you feel the nut. Now it's important here to hold the shaft in the same position you have it. And then put this cap on before releasing the shaft. And now you're going to put your screw in. Some guys do like to add a little bit of rebound in their shock, and the way doing that is you draw that shaft down. Draw that shaft down as you're right before you put the set screw in. Wipe any excess oil off. Give it a little pump, and you'll see that you have completely dead shock. No matter where you're at, it's dead. And repeat this step again on the next shock. Remember to hold the shaft. Tighten it down. Put your set screw in, or sorry, your 1.5 millimeter head screw in the shaft and the cap. You don't need to kill these things. You just need to tighten them, make them snug. I've never had one fall out myself. Take your shaft, perfectly dead, good to go. Okay, next step is something that a lot of people don't know to do. What you're going to do is you're going to take your shock shaft pliers, and I like to punch a small little, I take the edge of the punch here. I guess that would work if I had them lined up. There we go. And I put a tiny, tiny little hole in there. You guys can see that. Little tiny, tiny hole. Reason so is air will get trapped in the bladder here, or this boot, and it can create a suction effect and actually suck any dirt that is inside the inside the boot into the shock. Just a little trick I like to do. So I'll throw and slide this on there. Grab my pliers, and I'm going to thread this guy on there. Sometimes these can be a little bit of a pain like this one, so what I'll do is actually take my body reamer. Actually, it's too narrow. Take an X-Acto blade and just kind of ream out, take a little bit of material, make it more of a wider opening coming in. So then threading these things on should get a little bit easier. It'll help start the threads. Just like that. And you don't want to thread these all the way on because we actually unthread them a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, now this is a really important step. You need to grab your calipers, make sure they're zeroed out in millimeters, and now we're going to measure between our bottom eyelet and the bottom of the shock and the top of the eyelet. You want to be 35 millimeters. It's 35 millimeters front, 44 millimeters rear. It does not weaken the your shock eyelet. If anything, I believe it weakens it if you have them threaded all the way in. So you want to be as close to 35 as you can. After you do this a couple times, it'll really start to become second nature, and you can kind of look at them and tell if they're done or not correctly. Go and slide your springs on. You're good to go. Now, next step, as I like to do, is I'll take a cutting bit on a Dremel, and I'll actually Dremel a flat spot here to give a shock index. When doing so, though, you got to make sure you have the shocks pointing the same direction. So, like as if they're going on the car, I will Dremel a small flat spot here, just in the shock adjuster, to make an index, so that way I know how many turns I'm turning as I'm tightening down or loosening my ride height. So then that's your shock build. I'm not going to bore you guys with the rear shocks. but it's pretty much the same build, just 44 millimeters in the distance between the top of the eyelet and the bottom of the shock. So thanks. Alright guys, so I finished the rear shocks up, and I actually did do the indexer there, so if you guys could see that little silver line there, I did that on all 4 shocks just simply with the German wheel. This is going to be bag B, and also I forgot to mention that I have 5-hole 1.6 pistons in the rear of my shock. I did the same thing with the dots on the piston, and the kit does come with gold front springs. I generally like to run yellow front springs just for a little bit more steering on my setup, but golds will work, and it's actually really good for the entry-level driver, and it makes a really easy car to drive. So other than that, that's the shocks. Now let's move on to bag B. I've already pre-built 2 of the diffs just to take a little less time in the video. You're going to need a Flashpoint or any type of black grease. I like the Flashpoint stuff. It's pretty consistent. Reason so is what you want to do. First step is you want to take your black grease, and there's a little groove on this outdrive, and you just want to run a small thin layer of grease on there. That right there is going to help with your outdrive not seizing up inside the diff cup. And also some pre-step prior to the shock video, what I did was actually applied a thin layer of glue on the pumpkin here, that where the aluminum piece is pressed into the plastic piece. Sometimes oil can seep, and it kind of works on every car that same way. I do this on every build I've ever done. I am using J&T N&B bearings. This is going to be my practice car, so this is my bearing of choice for any practice applications or race for that matter. This bearing is solid and it lasts forever, and it's super smooth right out of the box. So basically what we're going to do is install the bearing on the pumpkin. I like to take my O-rings, same thing as with the shocks. I like to throw a little bit of lube on them, or a little bit of oil on them, so that way they're a little pre-lubricated. You don't ever want to slide anything dry into them. So just throw that in there, seat it in the bottom, and you're going to take your outdrive now, and you're going to push it through. It's probably going to push that O-ring up. That time it didn't. I like to spin it as I do it just because it helps the O-ring stay seated in there. And you grab your needle nose, and you're going to need your sun gear pin. You're going to slide it through the side port. That's what that side port there is for. There's a little hole in the side. And you're going to basically slide it through the outdrive, and you're going to center it up. Once you get that in there, I like to take a drill or your 2.0, whatever you like to do. There's a set screw that goes in the side. Going to make sure you try and put it in there as straight as possible. Thread it in just past flush. You don't want to go too far, as what will happen is if you go too far, it can actually hit the internal gears, and if it's not far enough, it could actually hit your pinion gear. Some guys will come to me and say their drivetrain's notchy, and all it is the pin isn't pushed in all the way. Now when you put that set screw in, it does raise the plastic up a little bit. What I like to do is just take an X-Acto knife and just shave any of that excess plastic there, just to help with prevent any binding in the diff case. Prior to putting my sun gear, which is the big gear, I like to throw a little bit of oil down on the bottom just to help with any lubrication. Drop your sun gear down. Once you get it aligned, it'll snap in. And if you look there, as I'm turning it, it's turning as well. So now you're going to take your spider gears, put them on the shaft, your cross shaft here. You're going to put the small shim on the outside of the spider gear. Another spider gear, another small shim. I like to hold them with my fingers like this, spread them apart almost to where they're going to sit in, and basically wedge it in there, drop it in. Sometimes you have to use a little bit of force to get them in there because the diff cases are tight when they're brand new. So now you're going to take your next cross shaft and your spider gears, same sequence, spider gear on, shim on the outside. That shim is just to prevent any wear on the case. Now instead of putting the opening going up, we're going to rotate it going down because they have to sit in each other inside the case. So now same situation, you're going to drop it in, push it in, and then I like to give a solid little push just to make sure those cross pins are seated correctly. You spin it, make sure your operation is good, nice and free for the most part. It's going to be a little notchy because it is new. And take your other pre-oiled O-ring, put it inside your ring gear, install the J&T bearing, pre-greased outdrive, slide it through, and take your pin, center that up. I like to just set that aside now. Make sure it doesn't fall out. So set that aside. Okay, now you're ready to fill your diff up. So in my setup right now, I'm running 7K in the front, 4K in the center, and 2K in the rear. That's my base setup. I run that almost everywhere unless grip conditions get extremely high, or if the reverse is tracked super loose, I'll change it up. So basically, take my 7K. I've used a TLR shock oil bottle and filled up it with diff oil, so I don't have the little tubes. This just makes it something I like to do. Basically, what you want to do is to fill this thing up, and don't be afraid to overfill it. It's not a big deal. I like to rotate it slowly, and you'll see some air bubbles rise. I don't really care too much for the little tiny bubbles. I don't stress on them. Some guys will let their diff sit for a long period of time. You can. I personally don't. I haven't noticed a difference, but it's up to you guys. I make sure that the diff, though, like behind all the spider gears, that there's oil, that the diff is basically 100% full is what you're looking for. So as you spin this here, you'll see a lot of little air bubbles, and then you're going to get the bigger air bubbles. I make sure I pop the big air bubbles. Those are the ones that I'm more worried about. And basically, once you have the diff gear that's pretty much 100% full, other than the tiny little air bubbles, you're ready for the next step. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your sun gear here, and you're going to drop it in. This is a step that I was actually taught many years ago, and you're going to see there all the extra oil is going to basically push out of it. It's 100% normal. So now you're going to take your finger, just run it across. So now you have a diff that is 100% full. When you put your ring gear on, it's not going to overflow. It's extremely clean. I like to line the cross shaft up with the hole. That way it's easier to assemble. So now I'll put my gasket on, like so. Take your pin and line it up with the holes. So this way, when you go to assemble, all you got to do is make sure you line the holes up, and your cross shaft, your pin, will line right up, theoretically. Sometimes on a new kit, you'll have to kind of spin the gasket. Make sure, I usually throw a 1.5 in there and make sure I'm aligned. Push it down. Just recheck it again. Check cross holes. Okay, so that's now there. Now you got to run your screws in. And this is important too. You don't want to crank them down with the drill. You want to just get them nice and tight. Or, sorry, you want to get them right before they're nice and tight. So you want to do it by hand. The reason so is you want to make sure that this ring gear goes on straight. Okay, so once you have all four ran in, you're going to take your 2.0, throwing tools over here. Now you're going to go in a crosshatch pattern. So what you're going to do is go till you're snug, then go adjacent from that same side. So the reason for that is you're now tightening it equally all the way across to make sure that ring gear isn't coming down at a weird angle. Once you get it there, just go through, do a final snug, and there you go. Now when building it and they're new, they're going to feel a little notchy. That's completely normal. After you run the car for the first time, you rebuild the car, you're going to look at the oils like real dirty and contaminated. That's the metal shavings and any metal residue that's going to come off, the cosmoline, whatever the case should be when they ship it. That's completely normal. Your diffs are going to stink really bad. That's the process of breaking in a car. You have to do that in order to do it. The internal gears, I feel, get better as time goes on. I never change my internal gears. I will run them for 14 gallons or more. I think they just get smoother and better and better and better. I've never had one fail on me. But that is just me. Some of you may have different attitude or different responses for that. Next thing, when you're building the kit, it will get confusing because you have multiple diffs out here. The front and the rear are identical. The center obviously is pretty easy to tell. I usually get a silver Sharpie or a gold Sharpie, something that has some color. Obviously a black one you're not going to see. And on the side of the pumpkin here, I'll actually write what it is. So, as you can see, put 7K there, indicates as my front diff. Later on, that will be a big thing because when you go to put it in the car, it's hard to determine sometimes which one's the front, which one's the rear, and that's the last thing you need to do is put the wrong gear in there, or the wrong diff. So that's assembling a diff. I'm going to go ahead and do the rear and the center now. They assemble exactly the same. The only difference is the oil that I'm using is just different. Other than that, same bearings, same method, filling it all the way up, wiping the excess off, and tightening the screws down. Alrighty guys, this is bag C. A couple steps here, and a lot of things that a lot of newcomers don't understand or haven't been taught before is turnbuckles. Turnbuckles are a great tool of the car. Obviously we all need them. We need them to adjust camber and tow. But there's some tricks here, and if you look on every turnbuckle is going to have this. They're going to have a indicator. See how there's that one little groove on the top side of this turnbuckle? That indicates a direction. Every manufacturer is different. Some will turn right-handed if it's to the right. Some will turn left-handed if it's to the right. Regardless of the fact, just make sure that you install them all in the same direction. Reason so, I go with mine all to the right. Which means if I want to take the turnbuckle in, meaning decrease the amount of camber I have, I push my wrench to the rear of the car. So I would actually put my turnbuckle wrench on the car and bring it to the rear, and that would decrease the amount of camber I have. I'm sorry, increase in negative. So if I want to go to -3, for instance, from 0, I would go put my wrench on and go to the rear of the car, and that would decrease the amount of camber I have. And obviously opposite, if I want to make the link longer, I would go towards the front of the car. And it works the same way with all tow as well. I actually use just a Craftsman 6mm wrench. You could buy these in a pack that has like every size from 3mm all the way to like 7mm. They're super cheap. They're like $7. It's super cheap, a little easy to camber wrench, and they actually make it in a 5.5mm as well. So those little pesky little nuts that you can't get with needle nose or whatever the case would be, you can back it up with that. So I've already gone around and basically reamed out all the turnbuckles. I like to do this just a quick little turn. That's all you need. And I like to get in the practice of laying everything out, meaning this is the rear of the car, my steering, and my turnbuckles. It's never fails. Someone will get confused on which one's going where, and I'll explain to you why when it comes to putting the balls in, because they are kind of you have your inner ball and then you have your outer ball for the camber links, and it can get kind of confusing sometimes when you're trying to pay attention to where you're placing the line on the turnbuckle. So a lot of people, this is like a 10 scale thing, I believe. Anyways, that's where I learned it. I like to just throw a little bit of black grease in each one of these turnbuckle links. Reason so is it just lubricates a little bit, takes a little bit of the stress out of tightening them down, and also it just, I don't know, it seems to just last longer in the car. make camber adjustment easier. You're not having to wrench on the thing is so hard because it has a little bit of grease in there. And I'm literally talking like that much grease. I mean, that is nothing. Just literally enough to just, you don't want to make a mess, but just enough to help lubricate everything. So the book tells you to measure these things at a certain distance, all that stuff. Be honest with you, I don't. I don't like doing the whole measurement thing because you got to go back anyways later and remeasure it. What I do is I just, honestly, I thread them in, get them started, and then I'll do the same thing to the other side. And you try and do them equally. Reason so is when you put them on the car and you adjust it, you want it to adjust equally on both sides. That's literally my turnbuckle build. I don't go crazy with it. You can, if you'd like, you can go and measure everything and get it super precise. I do that during my setup and my final prep of the car. We'll set my EPAs and everything. That's when I do that. So I generally just try and do like a turn or two on both sides, and that's it. And I like to set them back in the order they're going. This will make sense here in a minute. So it's like a turn or two, that's it. And remember, one side's reversed. So when you lay them out all in the same direction, it actually makes it easier for you to remember which direction is going where. So there's that. So we did a running change on the turnbuckles, and we made a change to the rear ones. The rear ones are actually a 5.5 millimeter, and the fronts are a 6, and the steerings are 5.5. If you go with the Lunsford titanium turnbuckles, they're 5.5, and if you go with the HBRacing tie turnbuckle kit, they are 6 millimeters, all of them. So just a little preference there. You will need 2 wrenches via building the kit right out of the box. So you can use your ball-end tool or your shock shaft pliers. I find it just easier with a pair of needle nose. So basically this one here that has a little cone on the end, that's the one that's going to go on the shock tower. So that's going to be your inners for the camber links. And then the ones that don't have the cone, they're just a ball with a collar on each side. Those are going to be your outers. So it doesn't matter which side you put them in right now, because you can rotate this whichever way. I'm sorry, it does matter which side you put this in as far as which link, but as far as if you put it in the front or the rear right now, it does not make a difference because you can rotate the link when you're installing it all, and then you don't got to worry about it. Just snap that one in. So we're going to do the camber links first, and I'll show you the steering links. Just remember to pay attention. Sweet, just lost one in the garage. Remember to pay attention which side you're putting it in. Remember the cone one on the inside, the one with the 2 collars on the outside. Yeah, I'll do that one later, so I lost that ball. Okay, so now your steering links have 2 identical balls. One is going up, one is going to go down. So the way that this mounts is you have your steering plate here. This outside link is going to go on the steering plate. So you want to have that cone facing downward. And also, if you look, this thing doglegs to the back. You want it to dogleg to the back on each side. So for instance, you could theoretically install it with the dogleg to the front, but you're not going to get the steering that you need. So you need to make sure you have a dogleg to the back. Now if you install the ball going down, you can install it incorrectly. So you need to make sure that with the dogleg going back for that side, you want to have the flat side going down, and it's reversed in the inside. Snap those guys in. So remember, dogleg going back, ball's gonna go, or I'm sorry, the flat side's going down. And then the reverse side, you're gonna do the opposite. Flat side on this side, flat side on the top on that side. Minus the ball that I lost, real quick, I will get that done before the next video. That is turnbuckle building. This is basically how far I build them. I'll show you once I put them on the car to easily adjust them and get them equal. It's much easier than trying to measure and do it all right now. Alright guys, this is bag D. D is in Delta. This is when the car really starts to take form. Bag D consists of the chassis and the center chassis brace and mudguards. This one's pretty simple, it's pretty self-explanatory. What you're going to need is just some Loctite. I like to use just like TLR Loctite, Dynamite Loctite, or AE Loctite. This is the blue stuff. You really shouldn't need anything crazier than that. If you start going any crazier than that, it's when you're going to start stripping screws out or stuff's going to start getting seized. I use this same Loctite on everything on the car. Literally from camber links to 3mm nuts to no matter what it is. This is the same Loctite I use. Even the motor's screws on the bottom for adjusting mesh, I'll use the same stuff. I never have a problem getting it off. But anything going into aluminum, you're definitely going to want to put some Loctite on. And literally, I mean, just that little bit. There's not much on there. You don't need to go crazy with it. So you're just going to install the mud guards on. They actually thread into the chassis. Or previous models of D815, they had they threaded into the mud guard, which actually wasn't the greatest. So you're just going to go through, install these screws. A little Loctite on every screw. Some guys will put a Loctite like on their pit mat or something like that and dab it. That's fine as well. This is just how I do things. It works for me. Everyone's going to do their own thing. I suggest doing this by hand because you don't want to cross thread it going into the chassis because it's not like it's super easily changed. If you cross thread one of these or strip the threads out going into the chassis, you're kind of out of luck because I mean, you have to try and retap the chassis and it wouldn't be ideal. So there is 5 screws per side guard, which is really nice to help with flex in the car. And really, these mud guards, they don't blow off the car like other manufacturers have seen in the past, where mud gets tucked up underneath them, and you have to replace the mud guards because they won't stay on the car anymore. Ours are very, very well secured to the car, and I've never had an issue with them. The screws blowing through the mud guard blowing over the screws or anything like that in other previous models, you know, that's all been fixed now. So once you get these done, the mud guards are all on the car, or side guards. Now we have our new chassis brace. This right here is an optional piece. It does come stock with the vehicle, but if you don't like it, you can run the plastic one from the D817, not the V2 kit, but just a standard one. And if you look there, there's actually a beveled edge. The beveled edge needs to go up because if you run it the other direction, your fuel tank will get caught on it. So make sure the beveled edge is up. Basically slides on the chassis, and you're going to see you have 2 screw holes here for the mount. So you can run these screws if you'd like. I'm going to install them today, but I generally run the mount with no screws in it. Just kind of frees the car up, adds a little bit of flex. Super high bite, you're going to want to run the screws. Loose track, I would suggest taking the screws out. Super loose track, probably not run the screws at all. So you're going to go and slide them through, like so. Throw a little Loctite on it. Actually, there's a lot of Loctite. Before you start tightening down, I suggest sliding the other screw in, just so it's a little simpler to tighten everything down. The nice part about installing this now, though, is when you install your center diff, it's one less thing you gotta fumble with. Take your 5.5 driver and your 2.0. Get them nice and snug. That's bag D. Alrighty, so this is bag E, as in Edward. There's a couple things here that aren't in the manual. First off, this is that plastic plate I was telling you about in bag D. If you'd like to add more chassis flex, you can install this plate. It will add a significant amount of flex in the car and get more grip. So if you're struggling with grip and you're running the aluminum one, put the plastic one on, it'll help. Okay, so these brake pads are actually like real car material. That's why they last so long, they break so well. But if you look on this brake pad here, you have one side that's a circle and then one side that is an oval. But if you could see in there, the brake material isn't ovaled out. So what we like to do is take a drill bit. I just jack up a small drill bit that's the same size in my Dremel, and basically I will oval that hole out slightly. Doesn't need to be much. It's just going to make the brake pad actually float on the screw a lot easier. Some guys have whittled down their screws a little bit. You can do that if you like. This is the simplest way for me. Everyone should have a Dremel or drill and some drill bits. I mean, you could even go smaller than the hole. You just need to literally just oval that out. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so that one's done. It's very quick. Probably tighten down my Dremel a little bit better. That one's good. And it'll actually smell like car brakes as it's burning it off. There you go. Simple little step. Not needed 100%, but we recommend it. Okay, next step, take your brake pads and you actually take a little bit of brake cleaner, contact cleaner. Sometimes they will have a little bit of Cosmoline oil on them or some shipping oil. Just literally a small little spray each side. That's all I generally will do. And just to ensure that it's perfectly clean, just take a piece of Scotch-Brite, scuff them up just a little bit, set them aside. That's all I do. Well, this is the same process I'll do when prepping a car for a race. If I think fuel got spilt on my brake pads, or my discs or my pads, whatever the case would be, I'll do the same thing, and actually I will spray brake cleaner directly on these. That's something I do. It may not be recommended, but I haven't had an issue with it, and it's a quick way to clean your brakes. Okay, so next step is we're going to go ahead and assemble our brakes. So just for ease of use, to make sure you're installing the brakes on the right side, take your center diff and make sure that this thing slides over it. If you look there on the inside, there's a recess cut out for the bearings. If you try and do it the other way, it isn't going to work. So that way there fits. So if you look on the upper portion, there's a flat side and then you can see there's a beveled side. The beveled side is going to go in. So basically what we're going to do, you're going to take your brake pads, stack them, and you're going to take the 3mm screw here that has the long shoulder on it. That shoulder is going to be what the pads actually slide on. I generally like to just kind of hand start everything, so that way when you start getting on it, stuff's not jumping around. You grab your 2.5, and this is where it gets real tricky here, and I will show you guys the easiest way that I found is to keep all your builds consistent, so that way you don't have a car that feels better than another. What I'll do is I'll grab my calipers, and these brake pads, I'm sorry, these discs are 1.8 millimeters thick. So what I like to do is I will open these pads up all the way, and I will measure just to the inside of the screw, and I want to be at 2.8 millimeters. So I'll just keep tightening it in. So I'm at 3.0 now. Maybe look there, 2.8 millimeters. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. A little far. And you just need to do just the tips of your calipers. You don't need to shove the whole thing in there. So 2.8 millimeters, and I'll go back and check the same side I just came from, just to make sure that we're 2.8. Set that one aside. Grab the next top one. Grab your 2 screws. Stack your pads. Put your screws in, and then do the same exact process. So this way it's giving you a millimeter of pull. Now you can fine tune this. This is just a measurement that I've come up with. You may like less play in between the shoes. I generally like to have a millimeter of play, so that way I can actually feel the brakes and they're not just so on off. It's personal preference. You may like less or more, but this way is the easiest way to be 100% accurate that your brakes first of all are pulling equally. And when you do it this way, I'll show you at the end, your brake leakage won't hit your fuel tank. There's a lot of guys that run too much play in here, and then when they go full throttle, their brake leakage hits their fuel tank. So it takes a little bit of testing back and forth till you get about 2.8. If you're at 2.83, 2.82, it's fine. You just want to be really close to 2.8. So now those are built there. Next step is going to be your top plate here, or your center diff mount cover. You have your link arms here, which actually connect to your brake linkage. These are going to be facing each other like that, with the cone facing you. So the cone is actually what's going to pull your brakes. Actually, you know what? I apologize. Cones go away from you. Sorry, disregard. Okay, so you're going to take this here. Sorry, I got a reference on another car. I don't do brake leakage that much. Okay. So the little, there's a little stopper there that's going to go towards the back, or away from you I should say, and your linkage is going to come through. I like to install these ears towards you. Theoretically, yeah, actually yeah, it does. So they have to go away from you. Pop on your linkage there, and now there's a tiny little 1 or 2 mil, I believe it is. It's a tiny little screw that's going to thread through. Once again, go into aluminum. You want to do some Loctite. So this is a little confusing for you. I would just follow the manual. Like I said, I don't do brake leakage stuff. I very rarely ever rebuild this. So I do apologize for that. But basically what you're looking at is, as the brakes get pulled, it's going to go this way, and if you look the bottom side, that plunger is going to go out, which is going to hit your brake pads. It's going to hit your pad and close them, and then it's going to apply the brakes. So we're going to do the same thing the other side. Alright, brake leakage is very simple compared to other manufacturers, in my opinion. There's really not much to it. As long as you Loctite these screws here, I've never ever seen or heard of anyone's brake leakage coming apart. As far as middle of a race or a qualifier or anything like that, even a practice day. I've never had anyone's brake leakage. They come to me and said, hey, my brakes came apart. Okay, so once that's built there, now you have fully operational brakes. What I like to do is you take your center diff, line these things up to where they're basically going to go on the car. Oh, that's sweet. Install that one backwards. Apologize. 1 second. Then anytime you put Loctite on a screw and then take it back out, I would highly suggest putting Loctite back on. Okay, there we go. Both facing the same direction. We're good to go. Okay, so now I'm going to assemble this here. First off, sorry. Okay, so now you're going to take your center diff, put your discs on. Like I said, they may be a little tight, but they will free up. Make sure your discs go inside the pads when you're sliding this together. And now put your top plate on. Your diff cover. Aligning it sometimes can be a little bit of a pain. So you have to align the brake cams. There you go. Okay, so now this step here I cannot stress enough. Do not use your drill to tighten them. I just run them in with the drill and then hand tighten. Reason so is you will strip them out. If you use a weak drill, you probably get away with it, but my drill will strip them out. Okay, so you want to grab your 2.5 here now. And you want to do the same crosshatch pattern. Go from one to the other. Just to where they're tight. Make sure the diff spins. It's going to be kind of tight right now, being that it's all fresh stuff. But you see there, it spins. Test your brakes if you like. Pull these levers this way, You see there, it's very difficult to turn this diff. Good to go. That is bag E. Do apologize. We have to install the diff on the car for bag E. As you can tell, I'm not using the manual. So basically, what I'm going to do is slide the diff on there, center it up, and I highly suggest do not tighten these down until you have all four in. Just makes it easier to maneuver the diff around. Okay, so that now is bag E.